question in your own mind to determine what's going to happen with the dollar, stocks, bonds, gold, real estate. And I'm going to explain how you can predict the future in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, does quantitative easing equal deflation? In other words, is the process of quantitative easing the complete opposite of what everyone thinks it is? Is it deflationary? Does it pull liquidity out of the system? And there are 2 main voices for this view right now on FinTwit. And this is a huge debate going back and forth. 2 of my really good buddies I've got a tremendous amount of respect for. Number 1, right here, obviously, Brent Johnson without his bathrobe. And then the bond king right here, Mr. Stephen Van Meter. Both of these gentlemen believe that bank reserves are not a medium of exchange. We're going to start with that premise and then move on from there. So if bank reserves are not a medium of exchange, what purpose do they hold? Really, in their view, the only thing these bank reserves that are held at the Fed can do is facilitate more lending. It increases the balance sheet capacity for the commercial banks. A simple way to look at it is if they have 1 additional bank reserve, now they can create an additional loan. And it's not a 1-to-1 ratio or anything like that. Just that's a good way to look at it. If you have another bank reserve, then you can make another loan. If you have 1 less bank reserve, that's 1 less loan that you can make. And again, I'm just trying to oversimplify it there so you get your head around it. But the main takeaway is their view is bank reserves can only be used to create additional loans by the commercial banking system. This is very important that we understand this for the rest of the video. And these are some key points that I'm going to leave up for the entire video, step 1, 2, and 3. When we're talking about what type of money really affects inflation or deflation, it's really the broad money. So this is the money that's circulating in the real economy, chasing goods and services. And also, we need to be concerned with the velocity. How fast is the money circulating within the economy? And then how many goods and services do we have? So now that we understand Brent's view, the bond king's view, we understand these keys, and we understand the view that bank reserves can only be used to create additional loans. Now, let's go ahead and dive right in. We're going to start by looking at the balance sheet of the Fed and a typical commercial bank. The Fed over my left shoulder has assets and liabilities. Let's assume right now the assets on their balance sheet are treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. On the liability side, they have the bank reserves we were talking about, and they have cash for the banks. So the banks store their cash at the Fed. That would be an asset on their balance sheet and a liability on the Fed's balance sheet. And we'll assume that there's $100 in bank reserves and $100 in cash. We also have the Treasury General Account, the TGA. This is an account with the Fed. That's a liability on their balance sheet. So to start, we'll assume that there's $100 in bank reserves, $100 in cash, and $0 in the Treasury General Account. The next step is the government is going to issue a treasury. They're going to auction that off. They need more money to spend. So the bank is going to come in and buy the treasury from the government. So that treasury is going to go onto their balance sheet. That's a new asset. And they're going to transfer the cash that was on their balance sheet to the TGA. So what ends up happening after this transaction is done, the bank reserves held at the Fed still $100. The cash held at the Fed is now $0, and the TGA has the $100 in its account. Then on the asset side of the bank, they still have the $100 in bank reserves they started with, but now instead of the cash, they have the treasury that they purchased from the government. So I want to point out exactly what just happened to make sure you guys are following Brent and Steve's logic. So the money supply in this transaction just went down. They pulled liquidity out of the system. Why did this happen? Because there was $100 to start with in the, we'll call it the system, and now there's $0 because the $100 went down into the TGA. It's no longer in the banking system. It's no longer circulating within the economy. So the process of the banks buying the treasury from the government has pulled that $100 out of the system. Well, what happens next? The Fed buys the treasury from the bank. So how does the balance sheet change then? Now what we have is $200 in bank reserves. So this is where the Fed, quote unquote, prints money. They're not really printing money, they're printing bank reserves. So to buy the treasuries from the commercial bank, the Fed prints up $100 of bank reserves and adds it to their account. The treasuries then go from the asset side of the bank's balance sheet over to the asset side of the Fed's balance sheet. So now we have $200 in aggregate total in bank reserves. The $100 is still in the TGA, and there's zero cash for the banks. The bank balance sheet now has $100 in bank reserves that they had to begin with, and they have an additional bank reserves that the Fed gave them to purchase this treasury. And I want to note, in this step, the cash went down, liquidity was pulled out of the system. In this step, the bank reserves have increased and the balance sheet has increased. So another way to look at this is what has happened is the banking system has just swapped cash for additional bank reserves. And remember, Brent and Steve say the only thing that these bank reserves can be used for is to create additional loans. So to increase the amount of money supply circulating in the system by the same amount that it was decreased by the bank buying the treasuries from the government in the first place, the banking system would have to create an additional $100 in loans. Because the amount of money in the system went down by $100 here, that's why there'd need to be that additional $100 in lending just to have a wash. Of course, ideally, they'd want the banks creating more money so the money supply in the real economy would increase, not decrease, or just be at the same level. But Brent and Steve will come in and say, listen, the banks aren't lending. Sure, they give a loan here and there, but on net balance, people are paying off a lot more loans than these new loans are being created. Or at the very least, there's more liquidity being pulled out of the system through the process of quantitative easing than there's money being injected back into the system by these retail banks creating additional loans for consumers, entrepreneurs, businesses, etc. This is why they say quantitative easing is actually deflationary. Let's look at it very simply in the economy. We started with $100 circulating. Yes, it was on the bank's balance sheet, so probably not real high velocity, but it was in the economy. So we have someone growing wheat, let's say. We have 3 consumers there. There's money going back and forth to purchase the wheat. But if that $100 is sucked out of the system, now we have $0. These people don't have any money to buy any wheat. There's no economic activity, or economic activity decreases substantially. This oversimplified example is why they're both in the deflation camp. They see the dollar getting stronger and interest rates potentially going negative. Step number 2, QE is actually inflationary, not deflationary. So more of what most of us already assume. 2 main people on FinTwit hold this view. My partner in crime with Rebel Capitalist Pro, Miss Lynn Alden herself. And right here, Luke Groman, another good buddy of mine. And Luke, I need to sincerely apologize. I literally drew you 10 times and I couldn't not make you look like an NPC. So this is NPC Luke Groman thinks that QE is definitely inflationary. Luke, sorry about that, buddy. Okay, so the process is pretty much the same, but they think that bank reserves are actually a medium of exchange. So what happens is the cash on the bank's balance sheet really is just a bank reserve that they can use to create more loans, or they can use it to buy financial assets, which include treasuries the government issues. And that is a massive difference. That's night and day. So let me walk you guys through why that's such a big deal. The balance sheet of the Fed is still the same, starts with $200, just bank reserves. The balance sheet of the bank, same thing, $200. Bank reserves, the liability or customer deposits, and then the assets on the Fed's balance sheets, just the treasuries, mortgage-backed securities. We go through the process of the government selling the treasury to the bank. Same thing in step number one. The bank reserves would go from the bank's account down into the TGA, so there'd be 0 here, 100 here, but there'd be no change in the balance sheet of the Fed. There would really be no change to the balance sheet of the asset side of the bank, other than instead of $100 in bank reserves, $100 in bank reserves, now they would just have $100 in bank reserves and $100 in treasuries. But then the Fed buys the treasuries from the bank by creating more bank reserves. So then what we would have is the bank reserves on the Fed's balance sheet would now be $200, and the $100 would still be in the TGA. So what in this process has changed since step number one? Really, it boils down to, are bank reserves a medium of exchange? If they're not a medium of exchange, like Brent and Steve believe, then the liquidity has been sucked out of the system, because we started with $100 of cash, and that was the only thing on the Fed's balance sheet that was a unit of exchange. And we went from $100 down to $0. But like Lynn and Luke believe, if you think that bank reserves are a medium of exchange, then we started with $200 and we finished with $200. The liquidity is the exact same as when we started. So the next question that you're probably asking yourself is, okay, George, I get it. The liquidity stayed the same, but then how would quantitative easing be inflationary? Editor, let's zoom in so we can address this next topic. Let's start by looking at example 3 again, but this time I want to focus on the deposits in the commercial banking system, because this is really the money that is circulating in the economy, chasing goods and services. And remember, that was the key for this whole video. It's all about the broad money, the velocity, and the amount of goods and services. The Fed's liabilities, regardless of whether they're bank reserves or cash or how they can be used, really isn't as important as the liabilities of the commercial banking system, because those are the deposits for the everyday person, the people and the businesses and the entities that are in the real economy. So looking at step number 3, the deposits in the commercial banking system were $200. But remember, the TGA still needs to spend the money. They need to send out those stimulus checks. So let's say the average Joe that's receiving the stimulus check banks with the same bank that we've been using in our example. So the TGA would send the $100 to the bank. So when Joe deposits the check that he received for $100 in stimulus from the Treasury, when he deposits that into his bank, the bank credits his account $100. So you see what has happened? The deposits in the system have gone from $200 to $300. And how that looks on the balance sheet is now the liabilities of the Fed, as far as the TGA, go to 0. But the reserves, or the cash, whatever it was in the TGA, goes to the bank, because it's giving the bank a $100 deposit, therefore a liability. So it also has to give the bank an asset to match up with the liability. So how that works again is the funds go from the TGA to the bank to back up the new deposit that has been created out of thin air for $100. So the net result is we start with $200 in the system, $200 in commercial bank deposits. We end up with $300. This is how QE can be inflationary according to Lynn Alden and Luke Groman, because they're saying the Fed is monetizing the debt. So if the economy starts with $200 buying wheat, now it has $300 buying the same amount of wheat. Therefore, the price of wheat would most likely increase. And just so we're clear, let's go over this process one more time. The TGA sends Average Joe a check for $100. Average Joe deposits the check into his bank. So now the bank has an additional $100 in deposits. But the TGA has given the bank an additional liability. It's got an additional $100 of liabilities in the form of the deposits. So it has to back up. It has to transfer an asset to the bank. So the $100 or bank reserves or whatever you want to call it goes from the TGA to the bank. So now the bank has the new deposits or new liabilities of $100, but it also has a new asset in the form of $100 as well. There's now $300 in bank reserves, $0 in the TGA. The asset side of the bank's balance sheet has $300. Of course, the liability side has $300 as well. We've gone from $200 of commercial bank liabilities to $300 of commercial bank liabilities. And the deposits in the commercial banking system of everyday people and entities that are out there spending money on goods and services, those deposits that are the liabilities of the commercial banking system, is what really matters the most when we're trying to figure out if the future is inflationary or deflationary, because those deposits represent the purchasing power that's going to be chasing a certain amount of goods and services. And if the amount of liquidity in the system is the exact same before and after doing quantitative easing, our simple example of an economy starts with $100, and after QE is done, it still has the $100. There's no deflationary pressure that has been added by quantitative easing. And I want to be crystal clear. I'm not saying that one group is right and one group is wrong. The only thing I'm trying to do is explain their positions so you can understand them and make better decisions for yourself moving forward. You've got to realize that what we're playing with here is a 100-piece jigsaw puzzle where we really only have 10 pieces. And we're trying to figure out to the best of our ability, not just you and I, but also Lynn, Luke, Steve, and Brent. We're trying to figure out what the whole entire picture looks like with just those 10 pieces of the puzzle. There's 90 pieces actually missing, so there's a lot left to interpretation. And if you want my view or how I see things, if you want my interpretation of what's going on, unfortunately, you're going to have to wait for step number 3, and that's going to be in the next video. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.